You have accessed the podcast of OA. Located deep within Sector 14845 and powered by the Emerald Light of Will, the podcast of OA is your guide to the Green Lantern universe. Hosted by Lanterns Myron Rumsey and Bill Giancoli, the podcast of OA begins now.
Welcome back to the podcast of OA. This is episode number 114. I'm your host, Myron Rumsey. I'm flying solo this episode. My normal co-host, Bill Giancoli, wasn't able to record during this interview when we had it scheduled with Mr. Johnson. So it's going to be just me and Mike Johnson talking about Star Trek and Green Lantern. So sit tight and get ready for what I hope is a really entertaining conversation. For Star Trek fans, our next guest is kind of the great bird of the galaxy when it comes to the Star Trek comic book universe. From IDW Comics, Mike Johnson is writing the new series, Star Trek Green Lantern Stranger Worlds, which is a follow-up to Star Trek Green Lantern's The Spectrum War. Mike, welcome to the podcast of OI.
Thank you. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So it's interesting because usually when you see these intercompany crossovers, they're kind of usually a one and done deal. But what prompted IDW and DC to go back to the well for another one?
Well, the short answer is sales. That the first one did well enough that I think, like any sequel in any medium, if the first one does well, from a business perspective, you look at going back to the well and trying it again. But I think also it's just such a rich combination of mythologies that there's so many stories that you could tell by combining Star Trek and Green Lantern. And even when we were doing the first one, there was a thought that, okay, if this does well enough, let's do another one. And I sort of left it open at the end, if you remember. And spoiler alert, we're going to talk about the first series, The Spectrum War. So if you haven't read it, hit pause right now, come back.
First of all, if you haven't read it, shame on you. But
well, yeah, I wasn't going to say that, but thank you for saying that. Yeah. At the end of that, it sort of deliberately leaves it, not a cliffhanger, but it's like, whoa, Hal Jordan and the Enterprise are going to go off and have adventures together. So that was a deliberate choice so that we could end the Spectrum War in a satisfying way, but leave the door open for more.
It's kind of I don't want to say the formula, but when you have these crossovers, the initial thing is everybody gets to see the best of each universe, and they get to try on each other's costumes and rings and those kind of things. And now that that's kind of out of the way, with Stranger Worlds, you're kind of really deep diving a little bit into both universes, which as a Lantern fan, obviously I'm happy about, but also as a Star Trek fan, I'm really happy about to see both sets of mythologies explored to a greater length. Did you kind of have this storyline in mind when you were writing the first one, or was this something you came up with later?
I had the title Stranger Worlds actually refers to two planets. I got to be cagey here because after enough time goes by, I'll say exactly what I mean. But the title Stranger Worlds applies to two worlds in the DC canon that we weren't able to use, that it looked like we were going to be able to use, but we weren't able to use in this series. So hopefully we'll see them again later. That's the biggest tease I can say. So there's two DC worlds out there that were the original intention for Stranger Worlds. But when that wasn't going to quite work out, I just liked the title so much because it was a play on Strange New Worlds, that it still fit with sort of Oa being the strange new world that the Enterprise was going to visit. The story that I did have in mind was playing with the idea that their rings are losing power because there's no power batteries, as far as they know, in the Trek universe. Now we know that there are. So that was always the key story element for this sequel that I knew, like, let's dive in and play with the idea, like, what would really happen? Well, they would run out of power, and what does that mean for Hal? If Hal's not going to be a Green Lantern anymore, who is he? Is he just Hal Jordan, human stranded in this weird alternate reality? And Sinestro. So what is Sinestro without not just a yellow ring, any kind of power ring at all, of any color? And is he just going to be Emperor of the Klingons? And would the Klingons even want him if he doesn't have his power ring anymore to keep them in line? So it was sort of just like thinking about what happened in the Spectrum War and saying, logically, to use the phrase, logically, what would happen next? And that just seemed like really interesting stuff to get into.
I know for me, I think one of the moments that really made me chuckle and really get kind of excited was the appearance of the Manhunters.
Oh, cool.
In the Star Trek universe. This is, first of all, for people who haven't read it, again, shame on you. You should be reading it. But this is the Kelvin universe. So this is the timeline that got kicked off in the J.J. Abrams movie, and now we've had a couple movies since then. So this is the Kelvin universe, and you're really bringing the Green Lantern mythology in, and it's interesting how you're shifting kind of the timeline of when the Guardians are developing the Manhunters and so on, because it's not millions of years ago, it's in the 23rd century.
Yeah, that was sort of, it was both a necessity to shift the timeline in that way, but it also sort of makes sense that things don't always, in fact, I have Spock vocalize this in one of the issues where he's like, just because things happen in at one time in one reality doesn't mean they're going to happen at the same time in all realities. Which is like Spock voicing me as a writer saying, just go with me, okay? Just run with it. But it just seemed really like a fun idea that, okay, yeah, there is Oa, and there are the Guardians in this timeline, in this reality, but it's at a different sort of evolutionary point in the Trek universe, and that just opened up all kinds of things, like being able to use the Manhunters, and the idea that the Manhunters were sort of back in the early days of the Manhunters and Oa, they were sort of a Starfleet for the Guardians. They were the ones that went out to explore strange new worlds for the Guardians, and that's how we get the one that ends up being discovered by Hal and Kirk. And I wanted it to be a deliberate echo. If you look at the art, the amazing art by Angel Hernandez, that it's a deliberate echo. When they find the Manhunter, it's a deliberate echo of when they find Ganthet's skeleton in the Spectrum War. It's even like almost framed in the same angle where they find this Manhunter, this defunct Manhunter.
Now, one of the things that was really kind of shocking, it's funny, as a Trek fan, you'd think you could see some of these kind of things coming, but when you brought Khan into the storyline, I don't want to tip it too far for people that may not have read it yet, but when you bring Khan into the story, that was one of those, I can't believe I didn't think of this moment, so I applaud you for that, because you caught me off guard.
Right on.
So that was very cool. And there were two things in particular I wanted to talk about in terms of both mythologies. One of the things was how well you captured Sinestro's persona, especially as he's interacting with the Guardians, because he knows the history that they don't know yet, so they have no idea who he is, and there's almost a seduction there, which I really thought was really strong. That being one thing, and the other. One of the things I think that people sometimes have a problem with writing Trek is Gene Roddenberry's original concept of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy was that they reflected three parts of one mind. That Kirk is the ego, and Spock is the superego, and McCoy is the id, and they represent the logic and the soul, heart and soul, and Kirk is trying to parse it out. And I really thought, like in this last issue, the issue 5 that came out a couple weeks ago, where they were debating whether or not they should deal with Khan or deal with Sinestro. And it really played up. And I wanted to point it out because that's one of the things you don't see a lot. You don't see that interplay of how those characters represent parts of one mind. And when I was reading, I was like, this is pure Trek. at this point.
Wow, that means a lot to hear. And also hearing that you felt I got Sinestro's voice right coming from you, because, you know, I'm a Star Trek writer first, and I'm playing in the Green Lantern mythology, so I'm especially nervous when I read your reviews, because I know that you know Green Lantern so well. And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge Green Lantern fan. Like, I've got my Green Lantern miles under my belt. But you know, when you write characters as much as I've written the Star Trek characters, you gain a familiarity, and so it means a lot to hear you say that I got Sinestro right. He's my favorite DC villain, although I don't even really think of him as a villain in the same way you'd think of the Joker as a villain.
Right.
Sinestro is such a much more just sort of interesting, complex character, well-rounded. So I love writing Sinestro so much, and I think I'm glad you touched on a really key point, which is that Sinestro knows what the Guardians don't. And I think you used the perfect word, where it's like seduction. That's one of the tools in Sinestro's arsenal that he uses. And then when talking about the superego, you're exactly right. The ego, superego, and id of the Trek characters. One of the things I had to keep in mind was you sort of got to give the people what they want in stories like this. And if you have Kirk, Spock, and Bones in a story, and you don't have a scene with the three of them, then you're not giving the people what they want. Like, you kind of just got to go to the basics of, you have to have a scene with those three discussing something. And I love the idea that Bones is a little jealous of the bromance between Hal Jordan and Kirk, right?
You're right.
Like, he's not gonna come out and say it completely, but he's sort of like, all right, your new best buddy. Like, what do we know about? Actually, I think he does say your new best buddy in the comic, but he's like, what do we really know about this guy? And I'm your best friend, damn it, Jim. And I kind of like it that sometimes the characters, as you write them, they just sort of surprise you with what they would say, and it kind of surprised me, but it felt right that Spock would be the one who would be like, we should really go to Oa. And on the one hand, Spock is saying that because Sinestro ultimately poses a larger threat than Khan does. But on the other hand, I think there's a part of Spock that's like, let's go to Oa. Let's go to the center of the universe. Like, we have this incredible opportunity. So that was a really fun scene to write. I'm glad you like it. And it felt like the right thing to kick the issue off with that too.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, it felt very Trekish, which is what I'm hoping to get. You know, sometimes, and I think because you've written so much Trek, you obviously know the lore, you know the characters, you've got their voices down. But in the past, I've read books of licensed characters where it's all about using the license to sell the books. It's not about capturing the soul of the source material, and I think you really do that very well.
Cool.
Talk a little bit about the Hal Jordan Captain Kirk bromance. Those are two characters that are cut from the same cloth, and in the Kelvin timeline, Kirk is even more so like Hal Jordan than the Shatner version. I remember watching the J.J. Abrams, the very first launch movie, and I'm sitting in the theater watching it, and I'm thinking, that's Hal, you know. And I think
that's great.
When there were all those rumors a while ago about Chris Pine possibly playing Hal Jordan, that was weird. I think that was partially that, you know, because it was so easy to see him in that role, because that version of Kirk is really, because, you know, in the original TV show, Kirk didn't have that same tragic history, trouble with his, you know, the death of his father and dealing with that. He didn't have that part of it.
Right.
That's a new element. Right. And in it, the way that he handles it emotionally is very much the way Hal does.
Yeah.
So is it difficult for you to have those two characters being cut so close to each other on the same page? Is it difficult for you as a writer to kind of separate their voices without them becoming the same?
Yeah, you hit on a great. That's exactly right. That's sort of the line you have to walk. And one of the ways I tried to actually avoid that problem was to sort of steer into it and sort of not try to make them sound really different, because they are similar. So instead of in Spectrum War, the first series, rather than have the cliche of like they meet for the first time and fight and then they become friends, they actually recognize that they're on the same side essentially, but they're still, the differences come in how they might go about things and the fact that they're both really headstrong. So I sort of just wanted to play with that idea that like these guys immediately recognize that they're cut from the same cloth, and they're both military essentially. They're both risk takers and thrill seekers, but they have a very strong moral core, pardon the pun, and they have a team of people around them that they love and they want to protect. And they also both feel like they're in the service of something that's for the greater good of mankind, ultimately. So yeah, they do have a lot in common. One of the things that really helps is how great Angel is at drawing the Trek characters that look like the likenesses of actual human beings that live and breathe in our reality, but also drawing them on the same page with the Green Lantern characters that are essentially their comic book versions. You know, our Green Lantern doesn't look like Ryan Reynolds. He looks like our sort of quintessential Hal Jordan, but it doesn't feel jarring on the page when he's standing across from Chris Pine. And that's really Angel's magic that he brings to the book. There's a scene, I'm glad you brought up the fathers, because, you know, I hope we get to do another series, because there's a scene I want to do that addresses that point between the two of them. Because at this point by now, you know, they've spent enough time together that they'll have talked about their fathers. Yeah. And come to that realization.
These are two guys I can see sitting in a bar together.
Totally.
You know, talking and they're not guys that are quick to bare their souls, but they have so much in common that they can say things to each other without actually saying them, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll add is that I think in this series, when Hal is talking to Kirk about the possibility of his ring not working anymore and literally not being Green Lantern, that Kirk really responds to that because Kirk's lost his captain's chair before.
Yeah.
That the captain's chair is his power ring, right? And he can totally relate to, who am I if I am not a captain? Who am I if I'm not a Green Lantern?
Yeah, it's that whole sense of identity. They've thrown so much of themselves into what they do because they're so passionate about it and it's so important to them. It's a part of their identity, and when you lose it, how do you function without that part of your identity anymore?
Yeah. I can't wait for you to read the last issue.
I'm looking. You know, I'm really excited to read it, and then I'm also depressed about the fact that it's the last issue. If that makes any sense.
I have to say, this is. People always say the second part of something is the Empire Strikes Back of it. I prefer to say that it's the Wrath of Khan of it. that you'll see what I mean without spoiling anything. That this second series, Stranger Worlds, is very much our Wrath of Khan, and I hope we get to do Search for Spock. And so far, this series has done well enough. I think everybody on this side would like to do another series. You know, there had even been talk when the first series was doing well of like, what if this was ongoing? Like, what if you had an ongoing series that was a crossover? That's never really been done before. But I think it just made sense not to put too much of that burden on the book.
Right.
Because when you make something an ongoing, then it's like you're always like worried about sales decline and stuff. Whereas when we have these essentially 6-issue seasons, it works nicely, and I can tell a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. So my hope is that we do well enough, because I know I have a bunch of stuff that I would love to do in a third series, and you and I definitely have to talk after you read issue 6.
I know, and we're trying to dance around a little bit about the plot points, because there may be people who haven't read it, and I want to encourage them to pick it up, and I don't want to spoil some of the big beats.
Well, let's talk. We can talk about the end of 5, and this would be a big spoiler alert, and hit pause for anybody listening to this who hasn't had a chance to read issue 5, and we could totally talk about the end of it.
Okay, well, great.
So spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. That's right.
Hit pause right now and come back.
So in issue 5, a couple of really big things happen, and one of them, as we talked about Sinestro and the seduction of the Guardians, is he takes full advantage of the fact that Parallax is inside of that power battery.
Yeah.
And that to me was, and I loved how Angel plays up the proportions of Sinestro and how he captures that. I thought he did a really nice job.
Awesome! Yeah, Godzilla Sinestro.
Yeah,
I actually wrote in the script Godzilla because I had to make him. I had to differentiate. It's like there's Godzilla Sinestro and Sinestro. Yeah, I love Godzilla Sinestro. She had action figures.
Wouldn't that be great? And the other thing that happens, the big thing, in the first series, you had Hal Jordan in the center seat of the Enterprise, and in this issue, Turnabout is fair play, and you end by giving Kirk the first power ring of the Kelvin universe.
Yeah, finally. Yeah, it was. So it sort of. It sort of worked out just logistically that Kirk wouldn't get one in the first one because there weren't any Green Lantern rings to be had. So Kirk just didn't get one, but you had Captain Kirk has to get a Green Lantern ring at some point.
Right.
And having Oa in the story allowed me to introduce that concept that the Manhunters are in their prime, but the Guardians had started to fiddle with ring technology. Now, there's a whole aspect, as you know, of Green Lantern lore surrounding the creation of the rings and the first lanterns. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want, once you open the Pandora's box of some of the things in Green Lantern lore, they can quickly overwhelm the story you're trying to tell. So I sort of kept it contained that there was this one prototype ring that they had. That's not to say that if we don't do a third series, we might get into some of the other familiar aspects of Lantern history and see them play out in the Trek world. But for this one, I wanted to keep it sort of contained. So Ganthet goes and pulls the emergency cord of this prototype ring that enabled me to get Kirk a ring without killing anybody else. So I didn't have to whack Guy or John or Kilowog, much less Hal. Although, now that we're so much time has passed, I can tell you that my original pitch for the first series, Hal was going to die.
Really?
And give the ring to Kirk, yeah. And that was when, but we started to talk about, well, let's not kill the possibility of doing more of these. So let's not kill Hal. But in my very earliest conception of the crossover, it was that Hal would die and the ring would slip off Hal's hand and go onto Kirk's.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, this series, you've done something interesting with Carol Ferris. Which I was I was like, really? I never would have thought of that particular pairing of Carol and somebody else on the Enterprise. I was so surprised, and that's what I love about some of these crossovers is that you get to play in the sandbox. You're not tied. You're tied to the continuity, but loosely.
Yeah, exactly. It's a I don't want to say it's an Elseworld story exactly, because that makes it sound like it's totally divorced from the regular realities. This is sort of somewhere in between regular continuity and an Elseworlds. So there's elements that are the same, but there's still the freedom to have things like Carol and Scotty getting together. They're both engineers. Scotty's super charming, and it gets lonely in outer space for both franchises.
That's right.
Carol,
right.
I have to say, Carol, who I love as a character, one of the tricky things was just having screen time for everybody. Carol hasn't had a lot of screen time in this series, but she plays a very big role in issue 6. So if there's any Carol fans out there, they're disappointed that we haven't seen enough of her. You will see see her play a starring role in the last issue.
I want to see the Kirk and Hal in a bar and vying for the same Orion slave girl.
Okay, I'm taking requests for the third series.
Okay, so there's that, and I'll give you my other one. My other one is
that's a good idea. All right, I can't pay you, but I can give you variant covers.
That works for me, or even a little thank you blurb, or let me write the forward of the next trade
or the USS Myron or something. Yeah.
And the other thing would be the natural pairing of Larfleeze, Cyrano Jones, and Harry Mudd.
Yeah, so I know. Thought crossed my mind, and they're just. I couldn't make it. I couldn't inject. I wanted to use Mudd. I couldn't inject Mudd. I couldn't find a way to do it elegantly that didn't just feel like it was like putting a clown nose on the story. Like, oh yeah,
right,
do you know what I mean? Like, you have to be careful, especially when I'm trying to tell what is essentially a serious story. I didn't want it to be too. Like greatest hits cameos from everybody in both franchises. Right. But again, I'm hoping that in the third series there'll be room to bring in Mudd, particularly because I love Harry Mudd. So.
Well, and I appreciate that you approach it from that perspective, because you're looking to tell a story using these characters, and it's so easy to fall into the, okay, I got to have this happen because that's a cool moment. I got to have this happen, and you're kind of pacing it out and finding organic ways for certain things to happen, or things that maybe you haven't even thought about, certain things that come up in the story that you didn't think about originally that come up, and it's like, oh, wow.
That absolutely happens. I mean, it's like to say you make it up as you go along. That's not always the worst thing. A lot of times you will discover things in the writing that you didn't think about before because the story just takes you there. Talking about Larfleeze for a second, by the end of issue 5, he doesn't have his orange ring anymore.
No.
And that's an interesting thing I'd like to explore. Like, not just who is Hal without a green ring, but who's Larfleeze without an orange ring.
Right.
You know? What happens when you take away the thing that the greediest character in the galaxy wants most, and he doesn't have it anymore when he used to have it. Like, that's why I think I erred on the side of using Larfleeze as comic relief a little bit too much. Full confession here. But I would love to see that side of Larfleeze, actually, where he doesn't have the, like, who is he now?
Right.
And does he operate in the Star Trek universe like a Mudd character, you know? Like, how does that work? So that's we're basically writing the third series right now.
Yeah, Larfleeze.
Okay, hang on. Let me get
a pen. Get a pen. Yeah.
Okay. Orion, Slave Girl, Hal, and Kirk compete. Okay.
The interesting thing about Larfleeze, and it's part of the emotional spectrum. The further you get away from the center of the spectrum, the more the emotion controls you than you control the emotion. Yeah. So for Larfleeze, he's very much the Gollum of the Green Lantern mythos, and he goes from that, much like Gollum in the Lord of the Rings, he goes from that comedy part where he's comical, not ha-ha funny, but the character-driven comedy. But then,
because he's so extreme.
Yeah. And then on a dime, he can become the most sadistic, mean guy you could ever encounter. Mm-hmm. And he's
really scary looking too.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a monster.
So it's really he's really an interesting character when he's written right. I've seen some cases in the DC universe where he's being played for the jokes a little bit too much.
Yeah.
But when done right, he's a very complex character. The same with Atrocitus, that he's so driven, because he's at the far end of the spectrum, he's so driven by rage that he doesn't always think in a way that benefits him, and that he could probably win most of his encounters if it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't control it. And Carol Ferris is on the far right side of the spectrum. Her ring really doesn't function unless she's got someone to love.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's interesting you say that. Okay. Wait for issue 6. I like the way you put that. But yeah, and one of the regrets I have is that just because of time and space restrictions, I had to sort of we didn't see the Khan Atrocitus fight on screen.
Oh, yeah.
Or on the page. So And the idea is that Atrocitus was getting weaker at that point. And he was just overwhelmed by freshly thawed, 72 angry, cranky.
Those eugenics wars.
Freshly woken augments.
Guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was just outgunned.
Yeah, he was just outgunned. So poor rest in peace, big guy.
Poor Dexter's got nobody to come home to now.
That's the other one. Like, yeah, I'm taking the list for Series 3. Who knows who else survived? I can't believe they let me wipe out the DC universe in the first series. That was pretty great.
It was pretty ballsy, but it was a neat way to bring the mythos together in a way that seems very organic. I don't. Like you, I don't really look at this as an Elseworlds. I look at it as almost the Kelvin timeline of the DC universe combining with the Kelvin
fantastic.
timeline. You know what I mean?
I love that.
The kind of the same idea. So and I'm loving the series, and I know a lot of that comes from the fact that I've been a Green Lantern fan as long as I've been a Star Trek fan. So this is like the Oreo cookie for me. Both parts are great, and it's coming together. Maybe I should say Reese Cup. That's probably the better analogy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm really loving it, and I'm like I said, I'm looking forward to this last issue in a bittersweet way. But I'm really hoping we get more of it down the road. I really enjoy it. And I think you and Angel Hernandez do a really great job. And the likenesses are sometimes always a problem when you see some of these other books. There's another crossover going on right now with Green Lantern, and I have to say the likenesses are not anywhere close to where they should be, and Angel's done a really good job of capturing Hal and those characters and making sure that Hal looks like Hal and Kirk looks like Kirk, because again there's that almost natural, they look similar too. I mean, it's even worse. It
would have been weird if Chris Pine was playing both. That was part of me was like, oh, that'd be awesome. Part of me was like, oh, that's gonna be weird. But I'm gonna miss, because I've been on this series. It probably started about a year ago in terms of production, and like I love writing Hal and Sinestro and those guys, so I'm gonna miss them, and I love working with. I mean, I know in my heart of hearts this isn't the last time Angel and I will work together, but I haven't worked with that many artists that I feel as seamless a transition from what's in my brain to what's on the page. Like, he just interprets what I write really. He adds so much. He makes me look a lot better. He's just amazing. And like you pointed out, things like, what I would love for people to see at some point is his inks. I mean, the colors are amazing. But his sketch, his layouts that he delivers, and he's so fast, are really incredible. And things like, it's easy for me to write like scary Godzilla Sinestro, and then he creates what you see on the page, and like, wiping out Guardians, like, knocking over dominoes, just amazing stuff. And some of his artwork of Khan and his followers is very visceral, but it needs to be to convey the, I don't want to say savagery, but the brutality of it. No, how great! I call it Exorcist Khan. How great is his Khan, who's like, his skin looks bad, like his eyes and his mouth, and he looks like he's possessed. Yeah, and he is possessed by the Red Ring. Just amazing. So we won't do, if I have anything to say about it, we will not do a third series without Angel. It wouldn't be the same. It would be like recasting actors for the third movie of a trilogy. It has to be Angel.
Well, and it works well too, because you guys have been partners in the first series and this one, so there's a sense of consistency there that's really. I think it's important to the reader as well as it is maybe creatively rewarding. But I think as a reader, it's helpful because at least there's that level of consistency all the way through, and he really does a good job of capturing the actors' faces and making them look like they're right off the screen. He does an excellent job there. Yeah.
Yeah, and he does it in a way that works in a superhero comic book style. My regular artist on Star Trek Boldly Go, Tony Chastain, is brilliant, and especially with likenesses, but in a different way. And they both are able to make them look, as you're saying, like they're walking and talking like the actors have just been translated to the page. It's a real skill. it's a separate artistic skill that not everybody has.
Well, yeah, and I think you pointed it out earlier too. When you have comic book characters who are traditionally, I want to say, unrealistic looking in proportion and scale, and you are trying to put them next to people that are supposed to be air quote normal looking people.
Yeah,
there's a tendency for it to look a little hokey. But he does a really good job of, when there's a scene in the 5th issue where Hal is on the bridge of the Enterprise standing next to Kirk while he's in his chair, and it looks very natural. There's nothing that looks forced.
It's great. Yeah, it's great, and it may not be the same if it was like, a more muscle-bound character, but I think when you have Hal and John and Guy, Kilowog's obviously a different species, but it works well with the Lantern Corps. Again, the two franchises just mesh very nicely.
Yeah, this is probably the most logical pairing. It's funny because
I see what you did there.
Back in the 80s when DC had the Trek license, they never crossed it over. And I was always then I'm like, why aren't you guys using? You got licenses for you own one property and you have the license for the other. This is a group of franchises, two mythologies that interlock and interweave so perfectly well. Why not take advantage of it? So when this was first announced, I was like, oh, it's about freaking time.
Yeah, right. And by the way, I think obviously crossovers are a superhero staple. They're, traditional, but I actually think it's still in the spirit of Trek over with things, because there's goofy Trek episodes in all the different iterations of the franchise. You have your goofier, and I don't mean crossovers are inherently goofy, but just the idea of doing something a little out of the box is very much in the spirit of Star Trek. So, and one of the first alternate realities of pop culture was the mirror universe in Star Trek. So, right. It feels like it doesn't feel as weird to be crossing over Star Trek with something like, if you try to cross over Star Wars with stuff, that would just start to feel weird, because there's not really anything in Star Wars mythology that can justify that kind of stuff. But Star Trek mythology is full of, alternate realities and crazy time warp anomaly stuff. So,
yeah, I mean, there's so many places you can go, and let's face it, once you've done Space Hippies and The Way to Eden, pretty much anything is fair game.
Space Hippies. Again, taking notes for the 3rd series of Trek Green Lantern. So we'll get Prez in there. It'll be great. Yeah.
There you go.
Taking requests.
So thanks for joining us, Mike. I really appreciate it. Is there anything final you want to say to people that are listening that we didn't talk about?
I just want to say thank you to the people that have supported the book. You make it possible for us to make more by going to especially the people that, I love everyone who picks it up in whatever form, but the people that go to their comic shop every week and pick up the individual issues makes it possible to create more. And so I just want to say thank you to them. The feedback I've gotten on Twitter has been amazing. And to the Green Lantern fans, especially, thank you for being gentle as I work on these characters. And, thank you for feeling like, I feel like I got close to how they should sound. 'Cause I really, these characters are near and dear to my heart, and I want to do justice to them.
All right. Well, thanks again, Mike. And we will be talking to you very soon, I hope.
All right. Thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
The Podcast of OA is the official podcast of the blog of OA and a proud member of the Comics Podcast Network. Share your comments and questions by calling the show's voicemail line at 406-POD-OA. That's 406-763-6362. And Skype users can leave a voicemail on the show's account, Blog of OA. Emails can be sent to greenlantern@stny.rr.com. And you can also find the Blog of OA and the Podcast of OA on Facebook and Google+. Green Lantern and other related characters are the copyrighted property of DC Comics Incorporated and are used without permission. The Blog of OA and the Podcast of OA are fan productions and do not claim any ownership over the Green Lantern or any other copyrighted properties.